I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and today we're driving the brand new BMW X2. The X2 is to the X1 what the X4 and X6 are to the X3 and X5. That is to say, in a complicated way, this is a coupe version of the X1. However, it isn't as simple as that, because actually, the X2 is a pretty different car behind the wheel to the X1 front-wheel drive SUV that it's based on. In fact, in our time with the car, we find that it's a little bit sportier, a little bit more refined, and a bit more interesting to drive as well. But it'd want to be, because in Australia at least, the X2 is pretty expensive. At the moment, we can only get it in 20i configuration as a front-wheel drive vehicle, and it's just under $56,000, which is pretty steep compared to a number of this car's main rivals. The X2 badge isn't the only new thing about this vehicle. It also introduces a new system of designating the way BMWs look. The package is called M Sport X. We're used to M Sport, that means an overall sporty appearance, but X means additional ruggedness in the form of matte grey finishes at the front, side and back of the car. Given that the X2 is a BMW, it's an SUV and it's a coupe, we think it's got a number of ingredients to be really popular with young families in particular. However, that means that the cabin also has to be an attractive and practical space. So let's jump in there first and check out the X2 from the inside. As I said, the X2 is heavily based on the X1, and there's nowhere that's more obvious than sitting here in the front of the X2. The dashboard and almost all of the key components are shared between the two cars, but that's not to say it's a bad thing, because the X1 actually does have a decent interior for a small luxury SUV. You look forward at a layout that screams BMW, and a common complaint of BMW cars is that the interiors aren't very well differentiated from one another. But what that means is that if you buy one of the cheaper BMWs like this one, you get an interior that doesn't look too different from, say, a 7 Series, so take from that what you will. In the center of the cabin is the technology offering. As standard, the X2 comes with a 6.5-inch screen, but here we've upgraded to the larger 8.8-inch version, which is paired to iDrive 6 and a touchpad-based rotary controller between the seats. Like other modern BMWs, they've also introduced touchscreen capability into the screen, although the screen itself has a matte finish rather than a gloss in some other models. The rest of the materials in the cabin are pretty nice. So there's soft touch up here on the dashboard, on the facing of the dash, and up here on the doors, and on this nice strip that's been introduced for the X2 only that runs between the two seats. You've got to feel right down here to find harsher plastics, so that gets a thumbs up from me. You also get BMW's lovely M Sport steering wheel, which is a perennial favourite here on Chasing Cars, nice and thick and meaty in front of you, with attractive paddle shifters for the dual clutch gearbox. As standard, you sit in Alcantara and cloth seats in the X2. However, here we've upgraded to the optional leather in this magma red colour, which is kind of like a Jaffa orangey red that I think looks fantastic. The seats don't have electric adjustment as standard, despite a price in the 50 grand range for this car, which is a bit of a surprise. You can add it in. They are quite adjustable with only the manual settings though, plus you miss out on heating if you don't have electric adjustment. This car doesn't have features like Harman Kardon stereo, wireless charging, or even Apple CarPlay, all of which are optional, but we do have the, once again, optional panoramic sunroof here, which lets a lot more light in. One thing that's standard is decent practicality. So there's two good-sized cup holders and a tray ahead of the shifter. There's a large, if I open this up, there's a large bin between the seats so you can fit in quite a lot of stuff. It's there that you find this car's single USB port. It should have at least two, but there are big door bins where you can fit a water bottle. If you need to fit a child seat in the X2, it's pretty easy because the doors open nice and wide. They close with a reassuring thunk, and you've got easily exposed ISOFIX points on both outboard seats. In fact, these seats, even for such a small car, they have a little bit of recline in them, so you can put it back and get relatively comfortable in the back of the X2. Because this car is longer than the X1, it means that legroom hasn't actually been compromised despite the sporty lines of the car, and as a 6-footer, I do have enough room. Enough headroom despite the panoramic sunroof, good legroom, and actually really good tow room sitting behind myself here. In terms of fitting 3 people, 3 kids will be fine because the hump in the floor is nice and low. 3 adults will struggle because it is still a small car. You've got some amenities. There's a flip down armrest with cup holders in the middle there. There are air vents, a 12-volt socket too, plus large bottle holders in the doors to keep people refreshed on the go. Visibility's okay as well. The window sill is quite high, but the window itself is nice and big, so the kids will have a decent view out the back of the X2. In what is perhaps the world's most gratuitous use of an electric tailgate, the X2 has one. But it opens up nice and fast, and once it is open, you'll find that it actually has a really good boot, this car. There's 470 litres of space, despite the chopped roofline. That's versus the X1 that has 505 litres. Plus, it's a clever boot. It's nice and square. There's an aluminium surface here to stop your suitcases from scratching the paintwork of the car. Plus, there's a net off to the right-hand side to stop delicates from falling around. There's one of BMW's really good straps on the left-hand side for a similar purpose. There's a 12-volt socket, tie-down points, and there are 2 shopping bag hooks as well. So, what's the new X2 like to drive? Well, unsurprisingly, the feeling is quite familiar if you've driven BMW's other front-wheel drive products. So that's cars like the new X1 and the 2 Series Active Tourer. But actually, the X2 is a little bit better to drive than those cars, simply because it's lower, it's longer, and it's a little bit wider than the X1. That means that it's got a slightly better center of gravity, it feels more planted on the road, and it's a little sportier to drive as well, but it's only a matter of degree. Compared to BMW's rear-wheel drive offerings, the X2 isn't at that level of sportiness, but instead it feels like kind of a grown-up hot hatch in that quick, front-driven way with a nice turbocharged engine up front. Initially, the only engine offered with the X2 in Australia is the S-Drive 20i, so that's a front-wheel drive 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder petrol producing 141 kilowatts of power and 280 newton meters of torque. That power gets sent forwards by means of a 7-speed double-clutch automatic gearbox. It actually works pretty well, and in fact, for the first 100 k's or so of driving this car, I actually forgot the X2 had a dual clutch. BMW have done quite a good job in making this gearbox more refined than, say, Volkswagen's DSG, and it's only at very low speed and low revs that you feel a slight juddering effect occasionally around town with this gearbox. Later on, the X2 range in Australia will be supplemented with a higher powered diesel and also a 3-cylinder petrol, which is familiar from the Mini range. That diesel will be the sole all-wheel drive model, at least for this year. The others are front drive. The handling of the X2 is actually pretty good. The steering is nice and quick, mid-weighted, with a little bit more feedback than we've been experiencing in other new BMW models recently, so it's good to see a return to form there. There is a little bit more body roll than you'd get in something like a comparable 1 Series, which is a car that people should also consider if you're looking for an X2. However, on the whole, this is a pretty engaging and sporty car to drive in that traditional BMW sense. Another traditional BMW feature to the driving dynamics is that the ride quality is pretty firm, and you'll want to go for the adaptive suspension, which is $400, a pretty reasonably priced option. Adding the variable dampers simply makes the comfort mode a little bit more supple, which is what most people will want to drive the X2 in around town. Otherwise, this car is pretty quiet and pretty refined. The biggest criticisms would be that with over 140 kilowatts of power, the front wheels do get pretty chirpy in the 20i. Having all-wheel drive would have helped that. And in fact, there isn't going to be an all-wheel drive petrol, at least in the next few months, which is a bit of a shame. At least fuel economy is nothing to complain about. BMW claim 6 litres per 100 kilometres, and we've actually been getting in the low 8s around town, which is pretty good, all things considered. One more thing that I think BMW should have worked on a little bit more for a car that will be as popular as the X2 is the adaptive safety offering. This car can be had with things like adaptive cruise control, although it isn't standard like it should be, but you can't actually get blind spot monitoring or rear cross traffic at all on the X2, which is difficult because the C-pillar visibility is not the best, and so backing out of driveways onto a road means you can't really get a sense of the traffic coming towards you, and you don't have rear cross traffic to alert you to that. So that's my opinion of the new BMW X2. While it could do with a beefier petrol engine, all-wheel drive, and a slightly softer ride quality, the X2 is a fun car with fundamentally good dynamics and attractive lines. While small luxury SUVs are a bit overpriced in general, remember, you could get a 250 kilowatt M140i hatch for little more than this 141 kilowatt X2. The BMW certainly brings sexy lines, a premium interior, good practicality, and a unique personality to the table. If you're looking for a runabout and want something a bit special and a bit different, wearing BMW's Roundel badge, the X2 is a good bet.